Good day. This is the video lecture 2 for EDUC 800. Welcome cohorts 9, 10, and 9, 11. So this video lecture is going to get you to do a deeper dive into the process of what it means to develop the creative process for the development of your own leadership. This, I think, becomes very important because what it will do for you is give you a framework for beginning to think about how you can utilize this in relationship to change process and change management within any of your organizations. So with that, I want to start out again with this quote from Carol Sanford, that one of the purposes of why I'm having you do this is to begin to understand this idea of actualization of a system within a given place. And so by now, your team should have, or at least begin to pick the unique place that this learning environment is going to emerge. So the idea here is that you begin to understand the concept of wholeness and not the idea of breaking down a system into its parts, but understanding the wholeness so that the parts will be able to manifest that wholeness. So that's what I want you to keep in mind. So with that, what I want you now to begin to think about in relationship to that is this focus on potential. And as you think of the work of Heifetz and Linsky and the idea of adaptive challenges and technical challenges, when you look at this framework that I have for you, the technical challenges basically relate to management of the current reality. So what you're really beginning to look at in terms of your operation within a system is to maintain the system so that its goal and its effectiveness will be able to continue. So that's what you're trying to do by increasing efficiency and achieving a set of standards. That's what current reality is all about. The system is already manifesting what it is. Now, when you look at this upper section under adaptive challenges, now you're beginning to move into the world of potential. So if you think about what you learned in 845 with going down the left side of the U, what you are looking at here is how then do you let go to allow for future possibilities to emerge. And so the framework for that is that what you're working on is improving, the living system so that it will be able to reach the higher level of understanding the integrative whole and what its ideals and practices and how they add value to a community. So that's what the regenerative process is about. That's what adaptive challenges are. And you understand that the adaptive challenge, as Heifetz and Linsky point out, generally present the most danger to you as a leader. Now, when you look at all of these concepts, and then you add in the idea of what Carol talked about in relationship to those paradigms, from value return and all the way up to the regenerative life, when you look at arrest disorder and value return, really you're dealing with the manifestation of the behavioral paradigm and the machine reductionistic paradigm, which is the predominant Western view of how systems operate. And what I think becomes important for you to understand is that this is not a universal point of view. because other traditions, Buddhist traditions, Taoist traditions, Hindu traditions, do not look at a fragmented way of dealing with the world, but they look at the totality of how the world is situated within a given place. But behavioralism, which was developed by John Watson and really brought out through the work of B.F. Skinner, is a predominant form, particularly in our school systems, that generally we have a tendency to allow a rest disorder to be dealt with through a behavioralistic or an external manifestation of behavior by controlling that behavior and not necessarily being concerned about the inner activities of a person, only what is being manifested by that behavior. So that's what behavioralism is about. Carrot and the stick, M&Ms, etc. Then what we have is the do-good paradigm, which came out of the human potential movement during the 1960s. And here, because of the reaction to the traditional structures that we've had, is that now we started focusing in on the development of individuals, the emotional intelligences of a person. We were concerned about human needs and expression. That's where that started, the do-good paradigm, which now we're beginning to emerge into this idea of the regenerative life paradigm or living system paradigm, where, as it states, knowing life as a nested whole, that becomes important. And if you really want to dive into understanding this in a little deeper way, I would strongly recommend that you get one of Fidjar Capra's book, The Web of Life, to give you a sense of how the sciences have now migrated towards this living systems view as opposed to the mechanical view that came out of the Newtonian world, that now we are beginning to understand how the quantum world, in terms of physics, is the way in which we are now reconceptualizing how systems work as being nothing more than patterns of relationships and networks, and that systems network with other systems within a given community. So I think these things are important for you to have an understanding of the what I might call the intellectual frameworks that underpin a lot of what we are doing today and how leadership is changing in that process. So when we think of system innovation and creativity, which is the space in which I am creating for you with this class, is that it's based upon two things. One is new ways of thinking. So when you look at 800, what it gave you in relationship to what systems are and how systems function, and then in 845, how you began to think about the way in which we are able to overcome the habitual thinking that we all experience within our organizations in order to create new pathways for thinking. And then what we do is we connect that to this concept of new ways of organizing. So we do not look at systems from a hierarchical point of view, which comes out of Newtonian world, but now we're beginning to understand that life is nothing more than patterns of organizing, new ways of putting things together, more decentralized and network models. So what I want you to think about is, all right, what's the shift in thinking that is necessary in order to create new learning environments? And how then do we structure these? Do we utilize the hierarchical structure, or do we begin to allow ourselves to think about network structures, and what does that mean in relationship to the design of learning environments? So keep that in mind. So why systems reimaging the concepts? Well, basically, as I said, we're trying to break away from the focus on parts, fragmentation, because that keeps us from looking at the totality of the system. And if you remember about the archetypes in 800, that like that shifting the burden or fixes that fail, that our tendency is that we only focus on a certain part of a system. We try to mitigate that problem or that issue, which then, because of what we do to mitigate it, it creates unintended consequences. And we begin to see how basically life is not a linear process, that it's highly dynamic, that there are ebbs and flows to it. So that's one of the things that I want you to think about. And then the reason that we try to reimage it is that really a systems actualization approach becomes very relevant when we're dealing with complex challenges. So adaptive challenges, that's what Heifetz and Linsky was getting you to look at. And that really what we have to understand then is this idea of synergies and connectivity and integration, that these should be the underlying premises or the mindsets that will allow for these ideas to manifest themselves in new structural patterns within an organization. So that's why I'm having you look at these particular areas. Now, what I want to do is focus a little bit on some frameworks for thinking about the future. And if you look at page 12 and 13 within your handout, that regenerative development handbook that I've given you, now I just want to take you into the framework of the three horizons. And really, as you look at what I have here for you, is that it's giving you a way to begin to think about the idea of uncertainty that impacts all of us in terms of our institutions, whether it be family structures, whether it be our work structures, our schooling structures, et cetera. But what it does is it allows you to become more responsive from an active orientation. It gives us an understanding that we can shape our futures that we're trying to explore. And within that framework, what this class is about is really the idea of exploring potential for creating new images of learning environments, and that they are nested, within a given community. They're not fragmented from that. And again, those matrices that I have you working with is to get you to begin to conceptualize that and to visualize it. So when we look at this concept, it's a pretty simple concept, and you do have Bill Sharp in the one of the videos taking people through this concept, that the three horizons. And so in a very simplistic way, what you're looking at is time, and you're looking at patterns that take place over time within a given situation, an environment, a system, a community, et cetera, when it's dealing with this idea of uncertainty. So the first horizon, what I want you to think about basically is business as usual. It's the status quo. And what the H1 horizon works off of are policies and rules. So it's based on expertise, specialization, individualistic, and power. So that's how many times, because of the hierarchical structure of our organizations that are based upon the idea of a top leadership that filters down to other people in the hierarchy, which feed down to the people at the bottom, and how to do things. So that's business as usual. We see it in every single organization that we we have within any given community, whether it be healthcare, whether it be work, whether it be schools, whether it be the political, social justice issues, etc. So that's the H1. Now, coupled then to that process is what he calls H3, our future possibilities. And when you look at the H3, the requirements for H3 to take place is actually an increase in learning. It's very holistic and it is collaborative. So if you think about Otto Scharmer's idea of co-creating and co-sensing, that this in essence is what allows for the letting go to let come new possibilities. So what Sharp is saying is that as you look at this process, this is the H3, which looks at potentiality. And then what happens is the H2 framework, as I call it, the ambiguous innovation, that what's really driving or navigating that environment is transforming by regeneration, by understanding systems and changing systems and co-creating. So these are the three horizons that he talks about. And when you look at these horizons and you look at the framework in terms of the timeline, what happens in the beginning as the H3 emerges is that you now start envisioning at that particular point, which then, as you look at the transitional space, there's where enrolling towards the ideas that are emerging from H3. And then the last part is mobilizing, putting it into action. So these are the ways in which you can begin to think about a very simplistic framework for understanding how one begins to negotiate the possibilities of the future. So the key point about this, and this is very important, this framework's purpose is to bring the third possibilities into the present. So the future is present in the current reality. That's what this allows. And why this is very important for you to understand this, and to me, this is very critical as you look at this framework and the energy that is based in this framework, is that why this process and why you need to understand the idea of the possibilities as being in the present is that it's going to allow you to see whether you're exploring these possibilities in terms of changing the system, allowing for evolution in the system to take place, or are you being trapped in the H1 environment because what you're being told as you go along is, yeah, this is pretty good, and we'll just do this in incremental improvements. So think about schooling and think about how we look at the structure of schooling today. And I'm talking all the way from pre-K all the way up to university level, that we all talk about the factory model. And as I've given you in the past, I said one of the problems with this structure is that it is well over 130 years and we're all products of it, which when you look at the improvement processes that have taken place over the last 50, 60 years in schooling, they're nothing more than incremental improvements because the basic structure has not changed. So you need to keep that in mind, that the H1 and the status quo doesn't basically suck you into incremental improvement. That's the hard part about this. So what I want to do now is, once you begin to think about this framework as a possibility for your team to explore, what I want you now to look at is the horizons in relationship to the nodal roles and Harari's 21 lessons. So to do that, I want to go back to this entagram. And I think this is important. This comes out of Carol Stanford. I think it's like on page 183 to 87 or whatever it is. But this is a framework for thinking about where one's energy enters into in terms of a role in any given system. So again, look at the parent, look at the educator, the designer, the entrepreneur, all the way around these. These are entry points into a system. And so what becomes important then is that you understand the nodal roles as things that we do when we are confronted with certain issues that we want to explore or we want to lead in a given organization or within a community. That's important. So looking at these then, from this point of view, is that we have what she called the manifestors, which they seek to bring new ideas into concrete existence, all right? That's the entrepreneur. So if you think about what we're trying to do with STEM, is that we're trying to teach kids the entrepreneurial concept of design and development through the use of mathematics and science, etc. This has been around for a very long time. It's been labeled differently. I remember back in the 70s that we had programs like that to integrate these things. So, you know, that's what an entrepreneur is about. The economic shapers obviously allow for the development of the economy. That's what happens. And then what else is very important is how do we shape the infrastructures for the structure for a society to operate? The citizenship. What does that mean in relationship to who we are and the systems of citizenship that we have in this country? So looking at that, then you explore part one of Yuval Harari's book. He's talking now about technological challenges. And what he says is, and this I think is important, that humankind is losing faith in the liberal story that basically dominated global politics. And where this really took place was after World War II, when the Marshall Plan was put into place and the United States was able to go into Europe and rebuild it from the point of view of a liberal point of view of constructing new ways and building their economies, etc. So I want you to think about that. And what he's actually saying is that this is particularly really being confronted by the development in biotech and information technologies, that these are becoming very large challenges for us as we see this liberal story being gotten rid of and not believed in anymore. And I want you to think about our country, particularly as, you know, the turmoil that we're dealing with. So what that emerges is disillusionment. We begin to wonder about the concept of work. What about our liberties in relationship to this, about equality? And so what happens from this, and as Shohana Zuboff in her book, Surveillance Capitalism, really begins to do a deep dive into the development of this infotech environment, particularly with Google, Facebook, all of these large corporations, you know, even including Apple, et cetera, that what started to happen as they were allowing you to do things on the internet and allowing your home to be connected. So for example, those of you, when Google started out with the Nest thermometers and starting to build the smart home, what it was starting to do is collecting a lot of data on you. And then when you go into a website and you start buying things, it's collecting data on you, of which you really don't understand that it is collecting. And what it's called is proprietary behavioral surplus. Then these companies sell this surplus, this information, to all types of advertisers, to all types of people who are economic shapers. We have no idea what it is. And what happens then is this behavioral surplus then is fed into machine intelligence, which is AI. And what it ends up doing is being able to make predictions about your buying habits, etc., including, who you might vote for, what your religious preferences are, etc. And as Yuval Harari has pointed out, is that, we always talked about people hacking into networks. He's saying what this is all about now is the ability to hack our brains. So I want you to think about that in relationship to this. And as you are looking at all this that I'm giving you, I want your team to think about, okay, how then, if this is the emerging world that we're all, living in, what does it mean to us as educators in terms of the design of allowing for the essence and the capability and the potential of every kid to come, to come out and to live in this emerging future? So that's the first part of this. Second part I want you to think about now is, again, the citizenship, the earth tender, what the understanding of the regenerative life, which is basically the interconnectiveness of the wholeness of the ecosystem in which we all live in, and then media content creators. And then that renewing spirit, I think, is important, because if you think back to Otto Scharmer's three divides, his three divides, and particularly the one that is self to self, and you think about there are 800,000 suicides committed on this planet every year because of the disillusionment that is happening, this becomes a very important component in relationship to our thinking about the design of what educational environments need to look like. Because what Yuval's now talking about, and here's where shaping infrastructure comes into play, the political challenges. So as the information technology increases, social media, the biotech, cloning and all of these things and possibilities, that really he's saying is that any solution to the technological challenges has to involve global collaboration. But problem is right now is the rise of nationalism and religious points of view and the cultural divide, because of a backlash towards the mistrust in institutions, traditional institutions, that liberal story that was there. And now what we're beginning to say that he talks about is now we're wondering about the concept of community, the concept of civilization and nationalism, how that is emerging, and autocratic behavior, etc. And the fact that we are now beginning to see the emergence. So we have what? Christian nationalism in the United States. In Middle Eastern countries, we have the ideas of Sharia law, all of these things that are driven there that are not in relationship to a common direction of the planet. So if you think about that video, the overview effect, that to one extent, we are still dividing the planet up into these fragmented parts, which are creating these things. And this issue of immigration, which is very politically active in this country, but the complexity of immigration is not just tied into people wanting to come into this country, it's tied into migration patterns because of climate change, because of violence in these countries, etc. What Yuval is saying then is that there's three major things that the political challenges we have to deal with. One is the nuclear challenge. And the nuclear war threat is always there, and it's even increasing. You have North Korea. You have Putin talking about utilizing technical, nukes on the battlefield in Ukraine. if that happens, what's that going to do to the proliferation of the possibility of a nuclear war, et cetera? That's what he's talking about. Obviously, we know about the ecological challenges, don't have to go into that, but the technological challenges we're all experiencing now, particularly the advent of AI, and what that's doing to the structure of learning and the structure of the flow of information within our systems like school and universities and our work environments. So there they are as you think about it. And then finally, going back to what I had you reading in 845, Jonathan Haidt's book, as he says, human nature is not just intrinsically moral, it is intrinsically moralistic, critical, judgmental, which then leads to righteousness, which leads to self-righteousness. And that's the problem that we are facing in relationship to the fragmentation that is very relevant in this country today. So now, taking that, the last part of the nodal roles is in two areas. One is the initiators, that's parents, earth tender, and designers. And the initiators create the conditions for growth and development to allow for the manifestation of who I am in terms of my potential into this world. So if you're a parent and you're raising a child, what's the purpose of raising a child? So that their essence can emerge and hopefully they become the best person they can become. The designer is there to allow for people to understand how to deal with uncertainty. And the earth tender is getting people to understand the interconnectedness of all living things, followed then by these destabilizers. And teachers or educators are destabilizers because what they're trying to do is enhance the thinking capacity of every human being. And then what we're dealing with in terms of what destabilizers, and particularly today with media content, with social media, with then tying into AI and what we're going to be dealing with, the existential threat of knowing what is truth and what is not truth, that is becoming more and more fuzzier as we look at this. And then when we look at the development of disillusionment and the development of hopelessness as it relates to renewing spirit, that is under threat also, which now when you look at his section 5 is on resilience. So how do you live in an age of bewilderment? That's the fundamental question he's asking. And so when these old stories that we've had are really collapsing and no new stories have emerged, so as the educator and as the parent and as media content people and as designers, this now becomes a critical issue to begin to explore. And how then do we design systems that will address what he says the educational process, and he talks about that. You're reading about what his belief structures are around education. How do we develop meaning? How do I feel a connectiveness to this planet and to my fellow citizen? How do I develop the mediation as necessary to deal with these things? And so when you begin to look at the current reality, the H1, the status quo, then what I'm having you as teams begin to think about, how then do we look at the emergence of new possibilities in the present, and then how do we design the prototypes through H2? So that gives you the framework for how I created the structure of why you're doing this particular activity in this course, to help you to nurture the skill sets that are going to be important after you leave this program. So this is a framework for you to think about. And then as you look at this, I want you to understand what the essence of the designer role is. What is that? And so when you think about the essence of it, it's based on three three areas. One is the core value of what a designer is. And you guys are designers right now. That's what the space is all about. So it's manifesting new capabilities. That's what you're looking at. The core purpose of that then is to reconcile conflicts towards an essence-based view. That how do we develop the essence through our design to allow then for the core purpose to emerge, which is the growth and development of the end user. So it's everyone in the community of where these learning environments are nested in order so they can develop and allow their potential to emerge in the community. And so as you think about essence from the point of view of what the vocational process is that at this stage, then you see your role is to get one in touch with who they really are and what is going on in their lives. So that's what empathy is about in relationship to the design process. You need to understand who the individuals are and what their needs are in relationship to this emerging future, which then gets into the fact that you never lose sight of the larger wholeness of what your group is working towards in order to evolve the capacity for the learning environments to nurture thinking and discernment and action. So that's the essence of the role. So the question then is, how can this role really interact with the role of the educator? And so when you look at the role of the educator and what that role is about in terms of these three things, and is that the essence then, the core purpose of the educator's role is to understand the human's role in a nested system. That's why we do what we do as we interact with learners. Then the core value basically is stated as self and system actualization intertwined. How do I develop as a human being my potential, and how then does that potential interact with the systems that I am going to be living in and interacting with? And then finally, the core purpose of the educator's role basically is to develop intelligence. And that intelligence is not fixed. It's not standardized. It is related to the essence of who every individual person is and what their capability is and what their potential, which then, if I look at the role of the educator, and I'm going to use myself in terms of the vocational, where I am in relationship to that role. So I really see that my evolution over time now is to nurture your capacity for you to develop your thinking and to understand really what the regenerative paradigm is about in context to who you are and the place in which you operate from. And in this activity, the place in which your team is developing, of which then what I'm doing and what I'm hoping I am developing is the capacity for you to discover understanding at the level of belief, philosophy, and principles. So remember, that's the idea of the epistemology, your cosmology, and your ontology, how they interact with this to guide your thinking for yourself and not provide you with answers. All I'm doing is creating a space as an educator to give you, information, as I always say to you, that you take with a grain of salt, but you need to listen to it and allow it to interact with your perceptions and your lived experiences. Because what that's going to do then is really help you to think about your life as an evolving human being, but in the role as an educator, how you're evolving students who interact with you. So when I look at this process, this is what I want you to think about. Is number one is the designer and the educator. And when you look at the core values of both, and you look at the core processes of both, and you look at the core purposes, what I want you to think about is, how do you design a learning system? And actually, I should have gotten rid of the pre-K to 20 and just looked at a learning system that is intergenerational within that environment, that gives the students the capacity at all ages to explore learning and the appropriateness within any given social system. And finally, how do we design the system? Again, slash, the pre-K 20 and put intergenerational learning environments to help these learners to see their own mind, their own experience in thinking, and to learn from this understanding. That's going to allow them to connect to the purpose of the environment in which they are living in. So a way of looking at this is what you're attempting to do within yourself and within your team is shifting that paradigm from this idea of thinking about parts, which we're all involved in, because that's, the Newtonian world that we've all grown up and have been, nurtured in, to one of wholeness, the one of a shifting paradigm, which when you begin to think about the structures and how they're manifested, so what's in the center there is, the way in which we break down the schedule of the day and the way in which we organize a classroom with desk and the teacher up in the front, which allows you now to focus on analytical thinking. So we reduce down to create an account of the whole, but we get focused on the basic building blocks without really understanding the interconnectedness of those blocks. Now, what it's good for is understanding the how, understanding the internal workings and breaking things down, and it's designed to increase efficiency of the parts through incremental improvements. So we work on one part, whether it be a reading program or a math program or a social studies program. We'll work on that for a while. We'll let the other side go off to the side. Remember when you were in 800 studying the concept of the system archetypes? Remember the fixes that fail, or shifting the burden, or tragedy of the commons. These are the types of tools that can allow you to see the thinking that's going on within the present system, which then, when you now look at one that's driven by essence and potential, what you're really beginning to think about more and more is holistic thinking. You look at how the parts manifest the wholeness of the system. So again, it's good to understand why things are working, not how they're working, and understanding context, understanding how it's nested in the concept of nestedness within any given environment, and improving the system's coordination and its transformational change. So what I've developed here for you is a way to conceptualize why you are in the process of exploring an imaging or a re-imaging of what learning environments can look like in a community. So, whoops, let me go back for a second. So what I want you to think about is in this relationship here is basically innovation. So it's value-adding process. We're looking at system innovation. We're looking at new ways of looking at the system within its place. That's right now, you should all have at least come to some agreement of the place where this is possibly going to happen, and a new way of coordinating the parts to a system related to its wholeness. That's where you start from, the wholeness of it. And what it does then is the ideas that are essence driven, okay? And they are also manifesting themselves in the system being actualized in that place, that it impacts and it interacts with that place. So that's a way of thinking about the structure of your leadership as it relates to the creative process. Innovation, system innovation, new ways of thinking, or surfacing new ways of thinking, and then allowing for the wholeness of the system to be the focus. So with that then, and you've seen this one before, is that, again, to remind you about place, I've said to you, I think in the first video lecture, is that, think about the community you presently live in, not as the team, but as you presently live in. And I think about going back 50 years ago. What was that place like? 100 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years? What was it like? Because for you to truly understand this, to get a handle on it, is that, remember, you look at the human energy that is manifested in that place. How has the present culture evolved over time? That's why you go back and look at the historical data. What's the ecological energy? What's the relationship of humans to the ecology of the system? And then, very important one, what is the geological energy that is present within that area? So when you understand that the interconnectiveness of this, and you begin to think this way, and you begin to allow it to manifest itself in the way in which you design things, in the way in which you think about your own community that you live in, it's really going to help you to understand the potential evolution, continual evolution of that place. So that's why I'm having you look at that. And finally, I've given you this little framework about, the circles about from place out to human beings and culture, to human systems that develop, and then the natural systems that are in operation there. So my question then for you really to think about is, why is your prototype built in a specific place and community, and define its relationship to that place? And then finally, how does your prototype nurture a student or a learner's development of a connection of this learning environment to the community? So again, I think I pointed this out to you. My question is, why do so many kids, young kids, like in urban environments like Philadelphia or Baltimore, why do they kill each other? Well, are they not connected to the community, or do they feel so disconnected that the only thing that they can connect to is the gang and the territory? So think about that, how your environment might overcome that. So this is my conclusion to this lecture. I hope that it has gotten you to at least think a little bit deeper about why I've structured this environment this way, to help you to understand that relationship to the creative or the regenerative design process, to why it's important to understand it in nurturing your capacity as a leader, as you within your own systems right now have to deal with those adaptive challenges that we are all facing. So with that, if you have any comments about this, and I will be coming into your design teams over the next 2 weeks, I will meet with all of you just to see if you do have questions about this, and just the process of what you're going through, or if you have individual questions, please feel free to email me or call me or text me at any time. So I hope that I have helped you to get a little bit deeper into the design process.